Look at the American West today, and you are looking at one of the most audacious things human beings have ever built. Gleaming cities rise straight out of the desert. Los Angeles and San Diego along the coast. Phoenix and Tucson baking in the Arizona sun. Las Vegas glittering in the middle of one of the driest places on the continent. Vast green fields stretch across land that receives just a few inches of rain a year, growing a huge share of the vegetables and fruits and nuts that feed the entire country. Nearly 40 million people live here, in a landscape that by every natural law should be nearly empty. It is a monument to ambition, engineering, and sheer human will. A civilization conjured out of sand and rock. And nearly all of it, the cities, the farms, the power, the people, rests on a single foundation. One modest river winding down from the Rocky Mountains, the Colorado. Here is the terrible truth at the center of it all. That river was never big enough to support what we built on top of it. And now, as it shrinks year after year, the mismatch that was hidden for a century is becoming impossible to ignore. The American West was built on a river that no longer has enough water to support it. This is the story of that mismatch, why it was always going to end this way, and what it means for the tens of millions of people living in the shadow of a promise the river cannot keep. To understand the problem, you first have to understand just how strange and improbable the West truly is. Most great civilizations in history grew up around abundant water, along mighty rivers or fertile rain-soaked plains. The American Southwest did the opposite. It built a sprawling modern society in a place that nature designed to hold very few people, a harsh desert of extreme heat and almost no rainfall. The only reason any of it exists is that engineers found a way to capture and move the water of the Colorado River, damming it, storing it in enormous reservoirs, and channeling it hundreds of miles through canals and aqueducts to the cities and farms that needed it. The Colorado became the artificial heart of the entire region, pumping life into places that could never have sustained themselves otherwise. Strip the river away, and the whole edifice would collapse almost overnight. The cities would empty. The farms would return to dust, and the desert would reclaim what was always, in truth, its own. Everything the West is depends utterly on that one thin ribbon of water. The numbers behind that dependence are staggering to contemplate. The Colorado supports an economy measured in the trillions of dollars, a scale that would rank among the larger economies on Earth if the region it waters were its own nation. It sustains dozens of sovereign tribal nations whose relationship with the river stretches back long before any of the modern states existed. It irrigates several million acres of farmland, including desert valleys that produce the overwhelming majority of the leafy greens the entire country eats through the winter months, so that a salad served in a snowbound city thousands of miles away very likely traces its water back to this single river. It generates electricity from the turbines inside its great dams, power that helps light homes and pump water across the region. It fills the swimming pools and fountains of resort cities, waters the golf courses, cools the data centers, and slakes the thirst of a population that keeps on growing. 2 nations draw from it, since the river crosses the border and a share is guaranteed by treaty to Mexico as well. When you tally it all up, this one modest desert river underwrites a substantial slice of the food, the economy, and the daily life of a significant portion of a continent. The dependence is not partial or incidental. It is near total. Now, here is the part that makes the situation so precarious. The fact that too few people appreciate. The Colorado River is not, by the standards of the world's great rivers, particularly large. It is not the Mississippi, or the Amazon, or the Nile. It is a relatively modest desert river, and it always has been. Yet onto this modest river we loaded the entire weight of the American Southwest, tens of millions of people, and one of the most productive agricultural regions on the planet. It is as though we tried to support the roof of an enormous building on a single slender pillar. For a while, if the pillar is strong enough and the load is not too great, it holds. But if you keep piling weight on top and the pillar itself begins to weaken, then sooner or later the whole structure comes under a strain it was never designed to bear. That is precisely the situation the West finds itself in now. The load kept growing, decade after decade, as cities boomed and farms expanded, while the pillar beneath, the river itself, was quietly beginning to shrink. The mismatch was not an accident that crept up unnoticed. It was, astonishingly, built into the very foundation of the West from the beginning. When the states of the region first sat down to divide the river's water among themselves, more than a century ago, they made a fateful error. They measured the river during a rare stretch of unusually wet years, and based on those generous flows, they confidently parceled out shares of water to each state. But those wet years were a fluke, not the norm. Over the long run, the river carries substantially less water than they assumed, and so they divided up more water than the Colorado actually holds. From that very first day, the promises on paper exceeded the reality in the riverbed. The West was allocated a river that did not exist, a phantom of extra water that had been real for a few wet years and then vanished back into the dry averages of history. Every city and farm that grew up trusting those promises was, without knowing it, building on a foundation that had been overdrawn from the start. So why did it take so long for this fatal flaw to reveal itself? Why did the West enjoy a century of apparent plenty before the crisis arrived? The answer lies in the two enormous reservoirs that engineers built to tame the river, Lake Mead behind the Hoover Dam and Lake Powell behind the Glen Canyon Dam. These were not just reservoirs. They were gigantic savings accounts of water, capable of holding several years' worth of the entire river's flow. When the West collectively used more water than the river provided in a given year, the difference was simply withdrawn from these vast reserves, which had been filled to the brim during earlier, wetter times. The reservoirs functioned as a buffer, a cushion of stored abundance that quietly absorbed the gap between what was promised and what actually flowed. As long as those reservoirs stayed reasonably full, the underlying deficit was invisible. Everyone got their water, the taps ran, the fields stayed green, and the illusion of endless abundance held firm. The West was living off its savings, drawing down a reserve built up over decades, without ever confronting the fact that it was spending more than the river earned. And then, over roughly the past 25 years, the savings began to run out. A long punishing drought settled over the region and simply refused to lift, the driest such stretch in centuries. Year after year, the mountain snows that feed the river came in below normal, and the Colorado's flow dwindled. The great reservoirs, no longer being replenished as fast as they were drained, began to fall and fall. Lake Mead and Lake Powell dropped toward levels never witnessed since the day they were first filled, their combined storage sinking to the lowest point in generations, until together they held only around a quarter of what they were built to contain. Along their shores, pale bands of bare rock hundreds of feet tall, the so-called bathtub rings, marked how far the water had retreated, a stark visual record of a civilization draining its reserves. The buffer that had hidden the mismatch for a century was nearly gone, and as it emptied, the gap between what the West takes and what the river can give was finally brutally exposed. To put the scale of the drawdown in perspective, consider that in a single recent year, the two great reservoirs lost several million acre-feet of water between them, an amount roughly comparable to the deepest emergency cut the entire region has ever seriously contemplated. The system was hemorrhaging water faster than any realistic set of reductions could offset, and the reservoirs had sunk so low that their combined contents fell to the smallest amount held since the years when they were first being filled, more than half a century earlier, effectively erasing decades of accumulated reserve. Federal forecasters, whose job is to model the river's future, found themselves writing scenarios that had once been unthinkable, projecting the reservoirs dropping toward levels where the dams could no longer generate power, or in the most extreme cases, where water might struggle to pass through them at all. The language in official reports shifted from the cautious vocabulary of planning to the stark vocabulary of emergency, with terms like uncharted territory appearing in documents written by sober government engineers. This was no longer a hypothetical worst case discussed in distant academic terms. It was the observed, measured trajectory of the system, unfolding in real time. But here is the single most important thing to understand: the fact that transforms this from a temporary crisis into a permanent reckoning. What is happening to the Colorado River is not merely a drought, in the ordinary sense of a dry spell that will eventually end and return to normal. Something deeper and more alarming is underway. Scientists increasingly describe it not as drought, but as aridification, a long-term, likely permanent drying of the region driven by a warming climate. And the mechanism is crucial to grasp. As temperatures rise, the very heat itself steals water from the river, independent of how much snow or rain falls. Hotter air pulls more moisture out of the soil and off the surface of the water through evaporation. Thirstier plants and parched ground soak up more of the snowmelt before it can ever reach the river. Snowpack melts earlier and faster, and more of it simply evaporates into the warming sky rather than running down into the streams. The result is that even in years with fairly normal precipitation, the river now runs lower than it used to, because the rising temperature is quietly siphoning off the water before it can gather into the Colorado. The baseline itself has shifted downward. The river is not just having a run of bad luck, it is being permanently diminished. Scientists have put striking numbers on this hidden theft of water by heat. Studies of the river's decline have found that a large share of its lost flow in recent decades can be attributed not to a lack of precipitation, but to rising temperatures alone. To the simple fact that a hotter world is a thirstier one. For every degree the region warms, the river's flow tends to drop by a meaningful percentage, a steady tax levied by the heat that compounds year after year. And the warming is not slowing down. If anything, it is accelerating. This means that even a genuinely wet winter, the kind that would once have refilled the reservoirs and eased the crisis, now delivers less water to the river than the same snowfall would have decades ago, because so much of it is lost to evaporation and thirsty soil before it ever arrives. The West has watched this happen in real time, celebrating a big snowpack one winter only to see disappointingly little of it actually reach the reservoirs. The ground drinks first, the warming air drinks second, and the river gets what is left. This is the cruel new arithmetic of a warming climate, and it is why the old strategy of simply waiting for the wet years to return no longer works. The wet years, when they come, are no longer wet enough to undo the damage. This is the fact that changes everything, because it means the water is not coming back. For a long time, people in the West could tell themselves a comforting story, that the drought was a temporary misfortune, that eventually the wet years would return, the reservoirs would refill, and life would go on as before. But if the river is shrinking because the entire region is growing hotter and drier in a lasting way, then that comforting story is a fantasy. There is no return to the old normal, because the old normal was itself an anomaly, a wetter climate that is now slipping away. The West was built for a river that no longer exists and is not coming back. Each fraction of a degree of additional warming shaves a little more off the river's flow, and the trend, over the long term, points relentlessly downward. This is why the crisis is so profound. It is not a storm to be weathered, but a permanent change in the very foundation on which the entire civilization was constructed. And so the West now confronts a collision it can no longer avoid. A collision between the immovable reality of a shrinking river and the enormous, still growing demands piled upon it. The mathematics are simple and merciless. The region uses far more water than the river reliably provides. The reservoirs that once concealed that gap are nearly drained, and the river itself is delivering less every decade. There is no clever engineering trick, no new dam or canal or pipeline that can conjure water that does not exist. You cannot pump what is not there. The only variable that can actually change is the demand, the amount the West takes out. And that is where the true difficulty begins, because reducing demand means asking real people, real cities, and real farms to make do with less, in a place where nearly everything and everyone depends on having enough. Every gallon that must be given up is a gallon someone was counting on, for a crop, a lawn, a factory, a home. The abstract problem of a shrinking river becomes, very quickly, a wrenchingly human problem of who must sacrifice and how much. What makes this especially unforgiving is that the West has, in many places, already picked the easy fruit. Some cities have driven their per-person water use down dramatically, recycling wastewater and tearing out lawns. And yet the gap between supply and demand still yawns wide, because the problem was never really about waste. It was about scale, a civilization simply too large for its river. That means the remaining choices are the hard ones, the deep cuts that genuinely hurt and force real changes to how people live and what the region grows. There is no painless path. It is worth pausing to be fair to the people who built all this, because it would be easy and wrong to dismiss them as reckless fools. The generations who constructed the modern West were not acting irrationally. They built on what genuinely appeared to be a reliable and generous supply of water, backed by the full authority of law and science as it was understood at the time. They created extraordinary prosperity, fed a nation, and gave tens of millions of people homes and livelihoods in a beautiful and challenging land. The tragedy is not one of villainy, but of a collective, understandable optimism that ran ahead of the physical facts and assumption of abundance in a place that could not truly sustain it. And the hardest part is that the reckoning now falls not on those who made the original bargain, but on their descendants, on the people living in the West today, who inherited a magnificent civilization quietly resting on a foundation that was never quite solid enough and is now visibly cracking beneath them. The choices this forces are genuinely agonizing, and they pit legitimate need against legitimate need, with no easy answers. The largest share of the river's water, by far, goes to agriculture, to the farms that grow much of the country's food, and so any serious effort to use less water inevitably means confronting how that farmland is watered, or whether some of it must come out of production altogether. But cutting agriculture means threatening the food supply, the livelihoods of farming communities, and a way of life that has endured for generations. On the other side stand the cities, home to most of the region's people, growing fast and demanding reliable water for millions of residents, yet using far less of the river overall than the farms do. There is a real and difficult tension between protecting the food that agriculture provides and protecting the growth and stability of the cities, and between honoring the water rights that people built their lives around and adapting those rights to a river that can no longer honor them all. These are not problems with clean solutions. They are hard collisions between competing goods, and reasonable people acting in good faith deeply disagree about how to resolve them. Step back far enough, and what is unfolding along the Colorado River becomes something larger than a regional water dispute. It is, in a sense, a preview of a challenge that much of humanity may eventually face. What happens when a civilization grows beyond the natural limits of the resource that sustains it? For most of modern history, human societies have operated on the assumption that resources are effectively limitless, that growth can continue indefinitely, that we can always find or engineer more of whatever we need. The American West is one of the first places where that assumption is being decisively, undeniably broken, where a wealthy, advanced, technologically sophisticated society is running hard into a physical limit it cannot engineer its way past. How the West responds, whether it can find a way to contract its demands gracefully and fairly to fit within the river's shrinking means, or whether it fractures into conflict and litigation and denial, will be watched closely. Because the same fundamental lesson is coming, in one form or another, to many other places and many other resources around the world. So what? In the end, does it truly mean to say the West was built on a river that no longer has enough water to support it? It means that the era of assumed abundance is over and cannot be brought back by wishing. It means that the central task of the coming decades will not be finding more water, because there is no more water to find, but learning to live on less, deliberately and fairly, in a place that spent a century assuming it would never have to. It means confronting hard questions that were postponed for generations. How large the cities can really grow, how much farmland the region can truly sustain, and how a society reshapes itself to fit a foundation that has quietly shrunk beneath it. The reckoning is not optional, and it is not distant. It is here now, written in the falling reservoirs, the shrinking flow and the collapsing agreements that once governed the river. In the end, the story of the American West and its river is a lesson about the danger of building a civilization on a hope rather than on a hard-eyed accounting of reality. The West was not built on a lie exactly, but on a wager, a bet that the river would always provide, that the wet years would hold, that the water would keep coming. The river never agreed to that bet, and now it is quietly, implacably calling it in. What remains to be seen is whether the people of the West can do the difficult, humbling thing that the moment demands. To stop asking how they can force the river to support the world they built, and start asking how they can rebuild that world to fit the river as it actually is. The monument in the desert still stands, dazzling and improbable as ever, but its foundation is giving way, drop by drop, year by year. And the only real question left is whether the West will rebuild itself smaller, wiser, and stronger while there is still time, or whether it will simply hold on, hope, and watch the water run out. The river has already given its answer. Now the West must give its own.